Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahavidyan Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Welcome to our webcast of our Saturday morning class on Shankaracharya's Atma Bodha. We will continue with verse 14 in just a moment. We left off on verse 14. But first of all, just to introduce the next subject, and also there are two questions I'll answer very briefly here. In spite of the fact that the text is called Atma Bodha, knowledge of Atma, our discussion has been on Anatma, that which is not Atma, and we said that Anatma, the body, mind, etc., is the locus of the problem. So just like a medical doctor must study anatomy to understand the locus of disease, we have to study the body, mind, etc. to understand the locus of the disease of samsara, as they say, samsara roga. In that context, we have already completed our study of the sharira traya, the three shariras, the three bodies, the stula sharira, physical body, the sukshma sharira, the subtle body, non-physical body, within the physical body that enlivens the physical body, and the karana sharira, the causal body. And remember, it's very important to remember our definition of the causal body. The causal body is ignorance, avidya, because it's ignorance that is the root cause for the cycle of birth and rebirth. One of the questions was, is it the sukshma sharira that travels at the end of one life to the next, or is it the karana sharira that travels? Well, remember, karana sharira means ignorance. Doesn't really make sense to speak of ignorance traveling. The locus of ignorance is your buddhi, your mind, which is part of the sukshma sharira. So more accurate to say that the sukshma sharira travels and the karana sharira, which is ignorance, has its locus in that sukshma sharira, abides in that sukshma sharira. The second question was how this cycle of birth and rebirth comes to an end, and the answer is pretty obvious. The karana sharira is the cause for the cycle of rebirth. We went through that cycle in a prior class. Remember, all of these classes are available on YouTube, so if you miss a class, be sure to watch it before watching the next one for the sake of continuity, which is really quite important. So to break that cycle of birth and rebirth, you need to destroy the cause for the cycle. The cause for the cycle is ignorance, avidya, which is at karana sharira. How to destroy the karana sharira sounds very esoteric, but how to destroy ignorance is the question. And of course, you destroy ignorance with knowledge, which is Atma Bodha. Okay, those two questions are done. Our study of the three shariras is over, and then in the prior class we began a very important discussion of the 5 koshas, the Pancha Koshas. Kosha meaning a covering or sheath, and we went through in some detail how the 5 koshas are equivalent in many ways to the 3 shariras. But the purpose of the topic, Pancha Kosha, is more to show the problem of identification. If you remember from the last class, I defined kosha as a locus of identification. That's not a very common translation, but it's a very accurate one. Kosha simply means covering, but and remember, of course, make sure that you watch my video on Pancha Kosha, where I make this point very elaborately, and so I won't go into the details here. Coming to the topic for today is each of the 5 koshas is a locus for identification. The physical body is a locus for identification. If I identify myself with this big lump of flesh, I then call myself Swami Taratmananda. I call myself a teacher of Vedanta in Sanskrit. I call myself a male. I call myself someone who's aging rapidly. All of these attributes I've just mentioned are associated with this lump of flesh, not with my true nature, which is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is not named Swami Taratmananda. We call it Atma. Pure consciousness is neither male nor female. Pure consciousness is not a teacher. You get the point. Pure consciousness doesn't age. So these are attributes of the physical body, but these attributes get superimposed on my true self, consciousness. And that's why this Annamaya kosha, this kosha made of anna, food, is a locus for identification. Next is the pranamaya kosha, the kosha made of prana, life energy, life force. So if I say I am tired, or if I say I am sick, I'm ill, the illness and tiredness are attributes that properly belong to the pranamaya kosha and not to consciousness. Consciousness doesn't get ill. Consciousness doesn't get tired. This is the problem of superimposition. This is the problem that makes us suffer so much. And so we see then that the pranamaya kosha is the second locus of identification. Next, the manomaya kosha, the kosha made of manas, mind. If I say I am happy or sad, if I say I am agitated or calm, these are attributes of the manas, mind. But I superimpose these, if I superimpose these attributes on Atma, I create problems. I create suffering. These attributes, like agitation and sadness, belong to the mind. They don't belong to consciousness. We'll understand this more clearly in the second half of this 14th verse. So the manomaya kosha is another third locus of identification. Then vijnanamaya kosha. Vijnana is a fancy word for buddhi, intellect. So the vijnanamaya kosha is yet another locus for confusion, for superimposition, for identification. If I say I am intelligent, or if I say I am confused, intelligence and confusion belong to the intellect, not to my true nature as consciousness. So these attributes of the buddhi, intellect, get superimposed on consciousness in this way. The vijnanamaya kosha is the fourth locus of identification. And the fifth is the anandamaya kosha. Ananda, loosely, bliss. And it's what remains in deep sleep, in dreamless sleep. In dreamless sleep, you have no experience of your physical body. You have no experience of the pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, and vijnanamaya kosha. The only kosha that is present in your experience is anandamaya kosha. That's the experience of dreamless sleep. In that, after you wake up from your dream, from dreamless sleep, you may say, I was blissful in deep sleep. That's identification. Consciousness is neither blissful nor non-blissful. Consciousness is just vast, pure, perfect. Bliss is an experience, right? To call consciousness blissful is to call consciousness an experience, but consciousness is the experiencer and not an experience of bliss. The one who experiences bliss is consciousness. That experience of bliss, that bliss belongs to the Anandamaya Kosha, not consciousness. So if you say, waking up, if you say, I was blissful in sleep, or if you say, I was in a state of deep ignorance in sleep, I was ignorant in sleep, I didn't know anything. These are expressions of identification with the Anandamaya Kosha. So in this way, the Anandamaya Kosha is the fifth locus of identification. Okay, we can now continue. We saw the first half of the 14th verse in our prior class. We'll continue with the second half today. Let's recite it. Recite after me, please. Pancha Koshas yogena, Pancha Koshas yogena, Tattanmaya hivastitaha, Tattanmaya hivastitaha, Shuddhatma nilavastradi, Shuddhatma nilavastradi, Yogena spatiko yatha, Yogena spatiko yatha. First half we already saw. The subject of the whole sentence is actually the beginning of the third line. Shuddhatma, Shuddha Atma, the pure self, pure consciousness, it is Pancha Koshas yogena. Yogena, due to association. My translation here, in the presence of, is not as accurate as what I just said. Due to the association with the Pancha Koshas, with the 5 koshas, that Shuddhatma, that pure self, which is stitaha, which abides along with the 5 koshas, what happens? Tat tanmayaha iva. It Eva becomes as though tat mayaha, the same as each one, or better, identified with each one. We saw this in the last class. The pure conscious self, Shuddhatma, becomes identified with each of the 5 koshas in the presence of the 5 koshas. Then, second half. Nila vastradi yogena spatikaha yatha. Another drishtanta, another metaphor. Almost every verse we see a new metaphor, drishtanta. Here the drishtanta in the last line, yatha, just like spatika. Spatika is a crystal. A crystal, yogena, in association with Nila vastradi. Vastra means cloth. Nila vastra is a blue cloth. In this case, we have an orange cloth. So yatha, just as a crystal, spatika, in association with different colors of cloth, acquires the color of that cloth. And here we have the example. This clear crystal appears orange in the presence of the orange cloth. The orangeness that you see in the clear crystal, that orangeness doesn't belong to the crystal, it belongs to the cloth. If you mistakenly conclude it's an orange crystal, you have superimposed an attribute of the cloth on the crystal. Notice the metaphor. Due to the presence of the cloth, a clear crystal appears orange appears to take on the attribute of the cloth represents each of the 5 koshas. And just as the orangeness of the cloth gets superimposed on the clear crystal, in the same way the attributes of each of the 5 koshas get superimposed on the Shuddhatma, on the pure self. This is a brilliant metaphor. It's been used for centuries, and it is so clear. It's another favorite example of how experience fools us. I've spoken about this several times before. We, in modern times, have become overly reliant on experience to tell us what's real. Examples we've given before. The sun doesn't really go down. The earth is turning. This chair really isn't solid. It's made of atoms that are almost all empty space. I've given these examples before. Examples that shows how experience fools us, so we have to be very careful about experience. Here we have the experience of orangeness in the crystal. Another experience that fools us. In the same way, we have experiences associated with each of the 5 koshas, and each of those experiences fool us. So the experience of having this physical body is an experience that can fool you into thinking that you are this body. The experience of tiredness or illness that belongs to your pranamaya kosha fools you into thinking that you, consciousness, are tired or ill. In the same way, happiness and sadness are experienced. But the happiness and sadness belongs to your mind, just like the orangeness belongs to the crystal. Happiness and sadness belongs to your mind, not to you. But the experience of happiness and sadness can confuse us. This is the issue. And it's a central issue. Let's examine this a little bit. Look at this. Does the orangeness really affect this crystal? Even a little bit. The fact is, not a bit of orangeness rubs off on the crystal. The crystal remains utterly pure, clear, in spite of the appearance of orangeness. In the same way, happiness and sadness in your mind don't affect consciousness. The consciousness which reveals happiness and sadness in your mind, we've spoken of this several classes ago. Happiness and sadness are mental events present in your mind, illumined by the consciousness which is your essential nature. When you're happy or sad, it feels like that happiness and sadness rubs off on consciousness. Feels that way. But does it really rub off? Does the happiness and sadness of your mind truly rub off on consciousness? Well, does this orangeness truly affect a crystal? Not at all. We need to be very clear in our understanding that the experience of orangeness is a misleading experience. It can't be trusted. In the same way, the experience that your consciousness is affected by happiness or sadness in your mind, that experience cannot be trusted. The truth is, just as this crystal is utterly unaffected by the orangeness that belongs to the cloth, in the same way, your consciousness, the consciousness that's your essential nature, is utterly unaffected by happiness and sadness which belong to your mind. Like orangeness belongs to the cloth and doesn't affect the crystal, happiness and sadness belongs to your mind and doesn't affect consciousness at all. So, good. Yatha, just as spatikaha, just as a crystal, Nilavastradi yogena, due to its association with different colored cloths, it takes on the color of the cloth. This is the metaphor that represents how Atma, due to the presence of the 5 koshas, the attributes that belong to the 5 koshas are wrongly superimposed on Atma. Good. Then we'll continue verse 15. This verse concludes our topic of the 5 koshas. Repeat after me, please. Vapustu shadibeh koshair, vapustu shadibeh koshair, yuktam yuktiyavaghatataha, yuktam yuktavaghatataha, atmanamantaram shuddham, atmanamantaram shuddham, vivinchyatandulam yatha, vivinchyatandulam yatha. Another metaphor, another drishtanta. Notice how the prior verse and this verse both end in yatha. Yatha means just as. And here, yatha in the last line, just as tandulam, the prior word. Tandula is grain, like rice or wheat. Yatha, just like tandulam, grain, is, go up now to the, by the way, in this verse, the words are scattered all over the place. I mentioned before that when verses are composed in meter, these verses are composed in a meter that has 8 syllables and a quarter, and there are a lot of rules about short and long syllables, which causes word order to be jumbled. So we have to unjumble the words of this verse. Yatha, just as, tandulam, grain, which is in the second line, yuktam, associated with. Grain which is associated with what? Top line, koshaihi, with koshas, plural. Koshas covering in the most broad sense. In this case, the grain is covered by what kind of kosha? Tushadibihi. Tusha is the chaff, is the English word. Chaff is the husk. You can imagine a little grain of rice with the husk covering that grain. The grain is tandulam, and the husk is tusha. So, just as that grain is yuktam, it is covered by tushadibihi koshaihi, coverings of husk. To make our metaphor work, imagine that there are 5 layers of husk. I don't know if there are 5 or not, I don't know. But imagine that the kernel of grain is covered by 5 layers of husk. Those 5 layers obviously representing the Pancha Koshas, 5 koshas. So before you can eat that grain, you have to remove the husk. How do you remove husk from grain? Well, by, in the second line, avaghatataha. Avaghata is striking, by beating, or you translate it by threshing. By threshing the rice, you remove the husk from the grain. This is a metaphor, the drishtanta. So just as by threshing the rice, you remove the husk from the grain, in the same way, here in the metaphor represents Atma. And here Atma is referred to by the first word, a little unusually, vapus. Vapus often means body, but it has some other meanings as well. One meaning is the essence of something is vapus. Another meaning is embodied. So here vapus really means that which is embodied, that which is within the physical body. Vapus here means Atma, the true self. So the metaphor is telling us that vapus, Atma, the true self, is yuktam, dropping down a line, it is associated with koshaihi, with koshas, not with husk. It's associated with the 5 koshas, Pancha Koshas, that we've just seen. And those koshas have to be removed. How to remove the koshas? You remove the husk from rice by threshing. And here it's a little bit like a pun. It says, you remove the 5 koshas covering Atma, not by threshing, but yukti avaghatataha, by threshing with logic, by the threshing of reasoning. My translation here is good. By threshing it with reason, by threshing the true self by threshing it with reason, not by grinding it with a mortar and pestle or running it through a machine, but by threshing the true self with reason. You can separate out the true self from the 5 koshas, and that's what the second half says. By threshing yukti avaghatataha, by threshing the true self with reason. It's kind of a play on words. By threshing the true self with reason, in the last line, vivinshyat. You should separate out what? In the third line, atmanam, the true self, which is antaram, inside. Just like the grain, the kernel, is inside the husk. In the same way, atmanam, the true self, is antaram. It is inside the 5 koshas. And the true self is shuddham, pure. We use that word pure too casually. Here, let's be very clear what that word shuddham means. It means that the true self, even though it's covered by the 5 koshas, is utterly unaffected by the 5 koshas. That's what shuddha, pure, means. Just as this crystal is utterly unaffected by the orangeness of the cloth, in the same way, Atma, the true self, remains shuddham, pure, utterly unaffected by the attributes that belong to the 5 koshas, which as though cover the true self. Very important point made here by Shankara, and that is the solution. He uses the word yukti, which means reasoning in the second line, but yukti implies knowledge. It's a separation between Atma and Anatma, a separation between your true self and the 5 koshas which seem to cover it. How to separate it? Please don't make the mistake. Separating a rice, the kernel from the husk, those are physical entities. Here we're not talking about a physical separation. We're talking about a separation that takes place in terms of understanding, in terms of knowledge. The term we use here is viveka. Viveka means discernment, being able to separate one thing from another. So we require these teachings of Vedanta to help us properly discern that our true self, Satchidananda Atma, pure consciousness, is within the 5 koshas and separate from the 5 koshas and utterly unaffected by the 5 koshas. The problem of, this ends our subject matter, so let's just summarize it here. When you identify with your physical body, Annamaya Kosha, you suffer because the problems that belong to your body become your problems. Consciousness owns problems now. Consciousness is pure. But due to identification, you end up owning the problems of the Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, etc., none of these problems truly belong to your true self, consciousness. Due to superimposition, you identify with the five koshas and suffer as a consequence. The solution to the problem of suffering, then, is discernment. Discernment means to understand that orangeness belongs to the cloth and doesn't affect the crystal at all. In the same way, discernment, viveka, means to understand the problems of your body belong to your body. The problems of prana belong to prana. Problems of your mind and intellect belong to your mind and intellect. And none of those problems can affect your true nature as consciousness at all. Your consciousness is Shuddha. We use the term Shuddha Chaitanya, pure consciousness. Just as the crystal is pure in the sense that it's utterly unaffected by any color, in the same way, your consciousness is utterly unaffected. And this is a matter of discernment and not a matter of experience. In fact, it's experience that gets us in trouble. It's your experience of the orangeness in the crystal that leads you to confusion. It's your experience of having a body, having a mind, having an intellect. These experiences cause confusion. The solution is not more experience. The conclusion is to the solution is not more experience or a special experience. Some people think that enlightenment is a result of a special experience. Experiences come and go. Experiences are unreliable, and experiences cause confusion. What we're after is discernment, viveka, knowledge, vidya, to properly understand our experience and to discern the fact that your true conscious nature is utterly unaffected by any and all experiences. Okay, that concludes that subject matter. Good. So I mentioned in a prior class that verses 9 through 15 dealt with the problem of superimposition. We've just concluded verse 15, and you can see that verses 16 through 19 discuss the nature of consciousness being all-pervasive. All-pervasive means, you know what it means, but the way we understand the all-pervasive nature of consciousness is this. Consciousness is not a physical entity that has an edge or boundary or limit. Consciousness doesn't have size, doesn't have width, doesn't have any dimension. That which has no dimension is dimensionless. That which has no edge or boundary or limit is limitless. Therefore, consciousness is limitless, like space has no edge or boundary. Space is limitless. In the same way, consciousness is limitless. We've seen that, but we're going to, in the next verse, we'll see this. Shankara bringing out further aspects of this, of Atma's all-pervasive nature. Verse 16, repeat after me. Sada sarvagato pyatma, sada sarvagato pyatma, na sarvatra bhasate, na sarvatra bhasate, buddha veva bhaseta, buddha veva bhaseta, swacheshu pratibimbavata, swacheshu pratibimbavata. To introduce this verse, consider the fact that if consciousness is bound, not if. Since consciousness is limitless, boundaryless, all-pervasive, then is consciousness in this chair? Well, if consciousness is all-pervasive, how could you keep it out of the chair? Consciousness is in the chair, yet the chair is not a conscious entity, not a conscious being. Another example, is consciousness present in a dead body? That's an interesting question. When somebody dies, does consciousness leave? From our prior discussions, hopefully you understand that what leaves the physical body at the time of death is the sukshma sharira, the subtle body, not consciousness. Consciousness is all-pervasive. How would you keep it out of the dead body? Then how do we understand the presence of consciousness in inert, lifeless things? Shankara explains here. Api Atman, end of the first line, Api, and when I say Api, I'm breaking the words apart for you. Api, even though Atma, the true self, consciousness, even though Atma is sada sarvagataha, sada always, sarvagataha, all-pervasive. Even though Atma is eternally all-pervasive, sarvatra, everywhere, na avabhasate, it doesn't appear everywhere. Even though consciousness is present everywhere, it doesn't appear everywhere. It's not experienced everywhere. So right now you experience, there's a subtle point here we better discuss. Excuse me. So you say you experience consciousness looking at me. You experience no consciousness looking at an object like a chair. So there's actually something wrong with that statement. So clearly, you don't experience consciousness in a chair. You look at me, a conscious being, and you presume that you're experiencing consciousness. It's a wrong assumption. How do you know that I'm not a robot carefully designed by some alien civilization and placed here before you to teach? A robot is not a living thing. From the outside, if this is such a cleverly designed robot, you couldn't tell the difference. So the point I'm making is a robot is not a living conscious being. How do you know this? What you're looking at is not a living conscious being. In fact, you don't know for sure. You presume. Of course, it's a good presumption. It's a presumption based on your own experience. You experienced yourself as a living conscious being, and there's no doubt whatsoever that you are a conscious being. Consciousness is immediately present in your experience. So since I look similar to you, in so far as I'm a human being, like you're a human being, since you as a human being are a conscious being, you look at me and you presume that I'm a conscious being. My point, it's subtle, but it's important. When you look at me, you don't experience consciousness here. You presume the presence of consciousness here. It's a subtle but important point. So, coming back to our verse. Api Atma, even though Atma, consciousness, sada sarvagataha, is all-pervasive, na sarvatra avabhasate, it doesn't appear everywhere. So I appear to be a conscious being. This chair does not appear to be a conscious thing. So how to differentiate if consciousness is all, not if, since consciousness is all pervasive, interesting, is consciousness more present in me and less present in this chair, or is consciousness equally present in me and equally present in the chair? Since consciousness is all pervasive, there aren't degrees of presence. It's equally present in everything, including me and including this chair. Then how do we discern inert objects from conscious beings? In the second line, Shankara says, breaking the words apart again, buddhau eva avabhaseta. Consciousness avabhaseta appears where buddhau eva. Buddhi is intellect. Buddhau, in the intellect. Consciousness appears in the intellect, very literally translating the third line. What it means is consciousness appears wherever there is a buddhi, intellect. And here buddhi is representative of the entire sukshma sharira. You can't have buddhi, intellect, separate from the sukshma sharira. In a prior class, we actually broke down that sukshma sharira into 17 constituent parts. You can go back and look at that class. We're not going to review that. My point here is you can't separate out those 17 constituent parts. It comes as an entity. So buddhi doesn't exist separately from the sukshma sharira. In this verse, buddhi represents sukshma sharira. Point here then is, Shankara says, wherever there is a buddhi, consciousness appears. Now, substituting the word, wherever there is a sukshma sharira, consciousness appears. So sukshma sharira is that which enlivens the stula sharira. So this stula sharira, this physical body, is invested with a sukshma sharira. That's why I'm alive and talking to you. This chair, on the other hand, we can say it's a stula sharira. It certainly is stula. It's a physical object. It is not invested with a sukshma sharira. It is not invested with prana, life, or manas, mind, or buddhi, intellect. This chair is an inert thing. Now, Shankara's point here is wherever there is a sukshma sharira, consciousness appears. Wherever there is no sukshma sharira, consciousness does not appear. And he gives us a wonderful metaphor. He says, just swacheshu pratibimbavata. Vat means like. So just as pratibimba, some of you know that pratibimba means reflection. A reflection, swacheshu, swacha means mirror here. It has other meanings. Here it means mirror. Just as a reflection appears in the surface of a mirror. So a mirror is a shiny, of course, not just a mirror, but any shiny surface can reflect your image. So if you stand in front of a mirror or a piece of glass or a shiny piece of metal, that shiny object has the capacity to reflect your image. And this is a nice metaphor. Just as a shiny object can reflect your image, in the same way, the presence of a sukshma sharira can reflect, so to speak, consciousness. Get the metaphor? just as wherever there's a shiny surface, your image can be reflected. Wherever there is a sukshma sharira, consciousness can be reflected. And maybe instead of reflected, why not we say manifest? So consciousness is manifest and apparent in me, this living thing. Consciousness is not manifest or apparent in this inert chair. Why? Because the sukshma sharira is present in me. Sukshma sharira is not present in this chair. So this is the basic point. Wherever there is a sukshma sharira, consciousness is manifest, consciousness is reflected, consciousness becomes apparent. Notice that I gave the example before of a robot. A robot is not a living thing. A robot, even a very sophisticated robot that might exist 1,000 years in the future. Today, robots are not very sophisticated. Eventually, they will become, you can imagine, one day in the future, there will be robots as sophisticated enough as human beings are, but those robots of the future are not living beings. Those robots of the future, as sophisticated as they are, they do not possess a sukshma sharira. Therefore, those robots will not, the word I'm looking for, the robots will not be self-aware. You are self-aware. To be self-aware requires two factors. One is awareness, consciousness, and another is a mind, intellect, manas and buddhi, through which psychologists have this fancy word, reflexive awareness. Reflexive awareness is a term used in psychology to refer to the fact that we can be aware of ourselves as conscious beings. They call that reflexive awareness. We can have reflexive awareness because we're conscious, A, and B, because we have minds. If there's only consciousness, there's no reflexive awareness, because you need a mind to reflect on your own consciousness, to appreciate your own consciousness. And of course, mind without consciousness is just an inert thing made of inert sukshma bhutas, inert subtle elements. So, in order to have reflexive awareness, in order to be aware of yourself as a conscious being, you require consciousness and a sukshma sharira. Those sophisticated robots of the future, they have consciousness, right? We said consciousness is all-pervasive, so you can't keep consciousness out of that robot of the future. But the robot of the future will lack a sukshma sharira, since it's not a living being that was born, and therefore that robot of the future will not be self-aware. You and I are self-aware. Computers and sophisticated robots of the futures are not self-aware, an important distinction. Now, there was another question that came, and let me address that question right here, and that is, consciousness reveals whatever is happening in your mind, intellect, and what is present in your intellect, consciousness is buddhau eva avabhaseta, third line. Consciousness shines in your intellect. Consciousness reveals whatever is happening in your intellect. Consciousness reveals all of your thoughts. Consciousness reveals everything your five senses pick up. Consciousness reveals your emotions. Consciousness also reveals the presence of ignorance. Ignorance is revealed by consciousness. Ignorance is known to you. Do you know the Chinese language? You know that you don't know. You know your ignorance. Do you know that your true nature as Satchidananda Atma is utterly identical to the underlying fabric of creation that we call Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, Brahman, the reality of all? You may not know that. That ignorance is present in your mind. The point I'm making here is consciousness reveals everything in your mind, including ignorance, and that consciousness doesn't remove ignorance because knowledge removes ignorance. We all know that. Knowledge removes ignorance. Consciousness does not remove ignorance, even though all-pervasive consciousness illumines your mind. That all-pervasive consciousness can't remove your ignorance, because in order to remove the problem of ignorance that's located in your mind, you require knowledge that's located in your mind. Ignorance in your mind is removed by knowledge in your mind. That's related to this verse. It answers a question. And let's see. I'm debating whether or not we'll go on to the next verse. I'd rather not, so that we give this verse the full, every one of these verses requires full attention. We have just a few minutes left in this class, so we'll conclude the class at this point, and we'll continue with verse 17 in our next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.